In this second section called Governing Through Technical Objects, I want to just very briefly review the lively debate that's gone on within science and technology studies and political philosophy over the last 15 years about the idea of political materials and the sort of attempts to explore how materials become implicated in governing, how they become constitutive of various governing practices. What I'm interested in is how governing, or the organisation of conduct, is realised through innumerable objects, instruments, technologies and materials. Now, working with Foucault's notion of technologies of government, I want to shift from the idea that that is simply a metaphor, which is how it's very often used, to the idea that that is an actual argument about the role of technologies and devices in shaping governing practices. I want to analyse how materials come to realise various forms of social order and social regulation, how materials don't just help assemble cultural worlds, but also administer them. And then I want to look at, in the next section, at two examples where you can see this argument in action. Now, the key theorist I want to use here is Steve Woolgar and Daniel Nayland's argument in their book that came out in 2013 called Mundane Governance. And this is really a fabulous book about the relationship between the ontological enactment of objects and what they call accountability relations. Now, the way in which they develop their analysis is through really close, almost ethno-methodological investigations of the connections between objects and ontology, or the forms of accountability and reasoning that emerge to constitute specific technical and cultural realities. They look at three objects: recycling bins, speed bumps and plastic bottles in airport security settings, in order to investigate how these things become implicated in governing. The key argument that they make is that accounting for things, developing accountability relations, is absolutely necessary in order to enrol objects and devices as technologies of governing. Now, these accountability relations can involve numerous techniques, from classification systems to moral justifications. Their key point is that accountability relations situate things in networks of mutual responsibility. Accountability relations shape how things should be responded to and what they are responsible for. And these relations are also always realised in practice in the way in which accounts are kind of enacted and given sort of real cultural force and presence by being done. And they also argue that these accounts are always open to being contested, to being reconfigured, that they're vulnerable to dispute. But their key point is that accountability is at the heart of mundane governance and ontological politics, that the work of producing accounts of things, what they are, why they matter, how they should be responded to, is political work. Now, this is a rich and complex argument about the ways in which ordinary objects and devices are enrolled and become implicated in the practical and everyday work of governing. Woolgar and Nayland show that governance and accountability relations are not antecedent to ontology, they are effects of it. This echoes Foucault's claim that materials and devices are not instruments for pre-existing governing objectives. They enact or realise governing by introducing diverse and often mundane forms of regulation into everyday life, by shaping conduct in subtle ways. The question is, what kinds of governing practices have emerged in the process of making plastic ubiquitous. The key point is that plastic objects and materials were not instruments for pre-existing governmental goals, rather that their specific socio-technical nature and capacities became implicated in constituting new modes and forms of governing new conducts. The issue is, how did they do that? How did these diverse technologies of plastic, and in the next section I'm going to look at two examples, plastic packaging and self-serve and cling film, to look at how they were introduced into everyday life and economies, how they provoked new conducts, and how they became devices in which governing moved through them, devices which governed us as much as we might have thought we were governing them.